we're getting into the 1980s, and the 1980s was a time where the Cold War started to slow down. And towards the end of the 1980s, when there's a beginning of unraveling of the Soviet Union and the beginning of what today we call globalization and beginning of new sectors of the economy, the high-tech sector, the pharmaceutical sector are becoming more dominant, then it was a crisis time for the Israeli military industry. And many people lost their jobs. The Israeli industrial sector had to adapt itself. It was no longer tenable to have, well, at some point in the 70s, it was almost 40% of the Israeli industrial workforce who were employed in the arms industry. There is no country in the world that has anything similar to that. In the 1980s, it becomes smaller, of course. And during the 1990s, when the Cold War is over, then there is a real crisis for the military industrial sector of the Israeli economy, and because there is no enemy anymore, for the West at least. There is no Soviet Union. Now, this is also the moment in which the Israeli government starts negotiating a peace treaty with the Palestinians, the Oslo peace negotiations. It's no coincidence that when the Soviet Union collapses and there is no more Cold War, the Israeli government can no longer say we have to keep fighting and to keep repressing the Palestinians because they're agents of the communist bloc. That doesn't make sense anymore. So now a new enemy needs to be invented. A new enemy needs to be found, and we all know that this new enemy was the Islamic religion. The Israeli government changed the narrative from we are the last defense of the West against the spread of communism to we are the last line of defense against the spread of Islam or extreme Islamism and so on. The Democratic Socialist Party that led the Palestinian resistance against Israeli occupation, the Fatah party, now became a negotiating partner for the Israeli government and a friend for the Israeli government, while the party that was more newly emerged, the Hamas party, which represented Islamic interests and was actually not so much an enemy of the State of Israel during the first Intifada, suddenly became the greatest enemy. And there was, of course, suicide attacks by Hamas against Israeli civilians. That is a major element of that story, that the Hamas party also participated in building this new kind of conflict by attacking innocent civilians and thereby justifying the Israeli government policies, which now were no longer policies of how to stop enemy armies, but instead policies on how to control an occupied population. And that changes the whole military industry. No longer is the Israeli military industry so famous for their Merkava tank. The Merkava tank was an Israeli development, is an Israeli development of a tank that can sustain a lot of damage before it explodes. But that's no longer a relevant weapon. The last time that there was any tank battle which the Israeli military engaged in was in 1973. That's a very long time ago. But what the Israeli soldiers really need to face on a daily basis is demonstrators, Palestinian teenagers throwing stones or putting up Palestinian flags and running away. And that kind of new enemy requires a different kind of technology. It requires anti-demonstration gear, riot gear, like bullets covered in rubber or in sponge, or various kinds of gases that call tear gas, but high concentration tear gas, and various kinds of handcuffs and leg cuffs and security cameras and surveillance cameras. All of these things are technologies that are needed to control a population. And with that, we see also how the Israeli military industry finds their customers, not in countries that need to fight invading armies, but find their customers in countries that need to control an unruly population, mainly countries that suffer from very high levels of poverty. And poverty causes social unrest, so you want to keep the people under control instead of solving the problem of poverty and solving the social problems. Why not just keep everybody under control by putting them in prison, by using surveillance cameras and so on. So Brazil becomes one of the major importers of Israeli security technology. India is a major importer of Israeli security technology. Mexico, Colombia, and so on. These are governments that need to control unruly populations. The United States, after the attacks of September 11, after 2001, also becomes a very important importer of that kind of technology, because it's part of the Patriot Act that was passed by President Bush and the newly founded Department of Homeland Security in the United States finds Israeli technology to be very fitting to what they need. And when George Bush calls for a global war on terror, then the Israeli arms industry finally gets out of their crisis. Finally, they're no longer in crisis. They're starting to make very high profits, and they're not very shy about it. I mean, when I describe it like this, it may seem like a very hostile thing to say to these people who are profiting from the global war on terror and becoming rich because of the aggressive policies of the United States around the world. But these companies are not trying to hide it. And in fact, if you go to the websites of these big Israeli companies, you will see on their first page of almost each one of these companies, our technology is battle tested. Our technology has been proven in actual testing on people. What does that mean? It means that for the Israeli military industry, they have turned the occupation of the Palestinian territory into an economic asset. This is known as the laboratory. There's also a movie called The Lab, which is very recommended, which shows exactly how this is done. And this has also been described and detailed by various scholars, for example, by Naomi Klein in her book, The Shock Doctrine, how Israeli officers say, I have experience as a military officer by controlling Palestinians in the occupied territory. I have fought against Hamas, maybe if that makes any kind of sense, because Hamas is not really an army. And I'm willing to offer my experience, my expertise to the customers and the kind of technology that I've developed in order to do my job better, to control the Palestinians. Then Israel becomes the global capital of the homeland security industry. And that is the moment, and only now, only in the 2000s, we can really talk about this sort of military-industrial complex, not just as a branch of the Israeli government, but as a really privately owned, large sector of the economy of people profiting from war and trying to promote additional policies, aggressive policies, in order to increase their sales. So it comes very late, only in the 2000s. Then there is, so shortly after the September 11 attacks, Palestinians launch their second intifada, a second round of uprising against Israeli occupation. Shortly before the September 11 attacks, it was in October 2000 that the Palestinians launched their attacks, and the September 11 attacks were in 2001. But the intifada continues until 2004, and the Israeli arms companies develop a very wide array of technologies to repress the Palestinian intifada. Most well known is the wall of separation, which is not just a wall of concrete. It contains many different kinds of cameras and remotely controlled guns, which were developed by Israeli companies, and even patrol robots that can have some level of independent decision-making while they encounter people on their patrols. That's another Israeli development that is now sold, for example, to the United States for the wall that President Trump wants to build alongside the border, along the border with Mexico. And that kind of technology becomes very important. And then we see that specifically the Israeli government changes its policy towards the Gaza Strip, creates it exploits the split within the Palestinian political movement between the Fatah and Hamas. And when Gaza becomes controlled by the Hamas party, the Israeli government responds by turning Gaza into really a kind of laboratory. That means that every 2 years, more or less, there is an invasion of the Israeli military into Gaza, which involves a very heavy bombardment from artillery, from tanks, and also from the air and from the sea. So that gives the opportunity to every branch of the Israeli military to show their technology. The new artillery designed for ships, the artillery designed for airplanes, or missiles designed for airplanes, artillery designs for ground troops. And all of these things are then immediately shown right after the attack on Gaza in an arms fair. The Israeli military holds a big arms fair where all the companies are invited to show their technologies, and there's an arms fair after every invasion of Gaza.
See here, the target is positively identified. The target coordinates are then transferred to the allocation system that immediately assigns a jumper missile to be fired by the virtual trigger in the operator's hand. The munition is then guided precisely to the target's coordinates. Thanks for your time and attention. Our IAI representatives await your every question and request.
And I am an economist. I look at economic trends. I check what each one of these attacks on Gaza do to the Israeli arms sales. And every arms fair then leads to a spike in the arms sales. But here I want to conclude with maybe a little bit of a more optimistic note, because the last arms fair was after the invasion of Gaza of 2014. In that very bloody summer, more than 2,000 Palestinians were killed by the Israeli military, by all of these newly developed weapons. But nevertheless, the Palestinians did not give up, and the fight continued for 51 days. It had a very, very deep impact, not just on the Palestinian economy, of course. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their homes, but it had a profound impact on the Israeli economy as well, because tourism to Israel has dropped, because a lot of factories couldn't continue to work, because a lot of organizations around the world decided they were going to boycott Israeli products. So when the invasion was over and they had an arms fair, the arms sales did not go up. In fact, they're slowly going down. The Israeli arms companies see that their customers are not so excited anymore with this new technology, because let's think about this. The Israeli companies are saying, we offer technology to control populations, so you don't have to make political compromises and economic compromises. Instead of engaging with the people in the favelas in Brazil, which live in abject poverty, and try to solve the social problems of the favelas, let's just surround them with checkpoints and drones and cameras, and then we don't need to think about them. This is the technology that the Israeli companies are offering. It's not working. The Israeli government itself cannot ignore the Palestinians. The Palestinians did not stop resisting. And it doesn't matter that the Gaza Strip is surrounded by checkpoints and drones and cameras. The people are still resisting. And when potential customers of Israeli technology see that, they say, well, actually, your technology is very shiny, but it doesn't do what it promises to do. It doesn't end resistance. It doesn't contain people. And I think that is maybe a sign, a certain positive sign, that we're not quite yet in the reality of 1984 as it was envisioned by George Orwell, a world where surveillance turns us all into prisoners. This is maybe the technology that the Israeli military industry is trying to develop, but they haven't quite developed it yet. And as long as there is resistance to that, they are losing money, and they're not even able to convince the Israeli government to keep on invading the Gaza Strip as often as they want to in order to test their weapons and try to get more customers.